the most wondrous new God, the most wondrous new gods, a most wondrous new God, the most wondrous new goddess, the most wondrous new goddesses, a most wondrous new goddess, the most wondrous old God, the most wondrous old gods, a most wondrous old God, the most wondrous old goddess, the most wondrous old goddesses, a most wondrous old goddess, the most wondrous greater God, the most wondrous greater gods, a most wondrous greater God, the most wondrous greater goddess, the most wondrous greater goddesses, a most wondrous greater goddess, the most wondrous lesser God, the most wondrous lesser gods, a most wondrous lesser God, the most wondrous lesser goddess, the most wondrous lesser goddesses, a most wondrous lesser goddess, the most wondrous greater spirit, the most wondrous greater spirits, a most wondrous greater spirit, the most wondrous lesser spirit, the most wondrous lesser spirits, a most wondrous lesser spirit, the most wondrous major God, the most wondrous major gods, a most wondrous major God, the most wondrous major goddess, the most wondrous major goddesses, a most wondrous major goddess, the most wondrous minor God, the most wondrous minor gods, a most wondrous minor God, the most wondrous minor goddess, the most wondrous minor goddesses, a most wondrous minor goddess, the most wondrous superior God, the most wondrous superior gods, a most wondrous superior God, the most wondrous superior goddess, the most wondrous superior goddesses, a most wondrous superior goddess, the most wondrous inferior God, the most wondrous inferior gods, a most wondrous inferior God, the most wondrous inferior goddess, the most wondrous inferior goddesses, a most wondrous inferior goddess, the most wondrous ancestor God, the most wondrous ancestor gods, a most wondrous ancestor God, the most wondrous ancestor goddess, the most wondrous ancestor goddesses, a most wondrous ancestor goddess, the most wondrous ascendant God, the most wondrous ascendant gods, a most wondrous ascendant God, the most wondrous ascendant goddess, the most wondrous ascendant goddesses, a most wondrous ascendant goddess, the most wondrous descendant God, the most wondrous descendant gods, a most wondrous descendant God, the most wondrous descendant goddess, the most wondrous descendant goddesses, a most wondrous descendant goddess, the most wondrous transcendent God, the most wondrous transcendent gods, a most wondrous transcendent God, the most wondrous transcendent goddess, the most wondrous transcendent goddesses, a most wondrous transcendent goddess, the most wondrous future God, the most wondrous future gods, a most wondrous future God, the most wondrous future goddess, the most wondrous future goddesses, a most wondrous future goddess, the most wondrous present God, the most wondrous present gods, a most wondrous present God, the most wondrous present goddess, the most wondrous present goddesses, a most wondrous present goddess, the most wondrous past God, the most wondrous past gods, a most wondrous past God, the most wondrous past goddess, the most wondrous past goddesses, a most wondrous past goddess, the most wondrous God, the most wondrous gods, a most wondrous God, the most wondrous goddess, the most wondrous goddesses, a most wondrous goddess, the most wondrous half God, the most wondrous half gods, a most wondrous half God, the most wondrous half goddess, the most wondrous half goddesses, a most wondrous half goddess, the most wondrous vessel, the most wondrous vessels, a most wondrous vessel, the most wondrous person, the most wondrous persons, a most wondrous person, the most wondrous image, the most wondrous images, a most wondrous image, the most wondrous belief, the most wondrous beliefs, a most wondrous belief, the most wondrous thought, the most wondrous thoughts, a most wondrous thought, the most wondrous word, the most wondrous words, a most wondrous word, the most wondrous action, the most wondrous actions, a most wondrous action, the most wondrous situation, the most wondrous situations, a most wondrous situation, the most wondrous circumstance, the most wondrous circumstances, a most wondrous circumstance, the most wondrous relationship, the most wondrous relationships, A most wondrous relationship. The most wondrous number. The most wondrous numbers. A most wondrous number. The most wondrous formula. The most wondrous formulas. A most wondrous formula. The most wondrous symbol. The most wondrous symbols. A most wondrous symbol. The most wondrous color. The most wondrous colors. A most wondrous color. The most wondrous thing. The most wondrous things. A most wondrous thing. The most wondrous way. The most wondrous ways. A most wondrous way. The most wondrous place. The most wondrous places. A most wondrous place. The most wondrous time. The most wondrous times. A most wondrous time. The most wondrous event. The most wondrous events. A most wondrous event. The most wondrous result. The most wondrous results. A most wondrous result.